Good evening and welcome to BCF Women Ministry, Women of the Bible Series 2021. We're so excited you're joining us, whether you're joining us from your living room or you're listening to us over the phone. Well, however you're joining us, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad you're here with us tonight. And I am equally excited to have my very own, my niece, my family from way yonder from New York for sure, London, England. So glad to have Pastor Danny Lancaster with us today from V2V Community Church, serving alongside of her amazing, dynamic mother and father, Pastor Douglas and Erica Goodman. They have been an incredible force in this world, really, as they've been preaching the gospel for many, many, many years. And Pastor Danny, she is an amazing woman of God. And I'm so glad that today we're going to be talking about Miriam. And I'm going to throw it right over to Pastor Danny as she just talks to us about Miriam. Pastor Danny.
Thank you so much, Pastor Q. It's such an honor and it's such a privilege to be with you. Hi, ladies. I'm all the way in London at the moment. It's supposed to be sunny and spring, but it's cloudy where we are. I'm so excited about this whole series that Pastor Q has made available to us as women, because I think that there's so much that can be gleaned from the women of the Bible. There is so much. I mean, even studying the life of Miriam has been so enlightening to me. And I think, we need to get out of the mindset that these are women of old. Yes, they've done things a different way. There was different traditions, but there's so much information. There's so much wisdom. There's so much knowledge that we can glean from these women. So I would say, when I'm speaking, when this series is going along, really see yourself, really picture yourself in these stories, in these women, in these characters. So I get the honor of talking about Miriam in the Bible, and I'm not going to presume that everybody knows who she is. Right. Even though she is a well-known character in the Bible, and you may have come across her story before, I'm not going to presume that everyone knows who she is. So we are first introduced to Miriam in Exodus chapter 2. So verses 1-4. So I'm going to quickly read that to you, just so that you can see and understand who she is. So Exodus chapter 2, and we're going to go from verse 1. Now, a man of the house of a Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So we're first introduced to Miriam as her name's not even given. But her role that she plays is so significant. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a backstory of where we found ourselves. So in the time of the Egyptians obviously ruled. And the Israelites obviously became this powerful people. They obviously were multiplying, and Pharaoh didn't like that. So obviously they were slaves, and he feared that they would one day overpower the Egyptians. So there was a decree made that any Hebrew boy would be killed. So this is what was happened. So obviously this is why Moses's mother had to obviously hide him. When she could hide him no longer, she obviously sent him into the river, and that's where he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. And we first meet Miriam in Exodus chapter 2, because she's obviously overseeing the fact that her brother has been sent down this river. So we first identify her as a sister. But I think what a lot of people fail to realize is that at this point, she's just a child herself. So she's not some grown woman that has all this confidence. She's a slave, ultimately. She's a slave child girl. And she has this, my first thing that I first noticed with Miriam is that she displays tremendous courage. Because if we read down from verse 5, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket amongst the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. this is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Let's pause. So remember, this is a brave thing to do, to volunteer yourself, to speak up, because remember, it would have been, you don't speak unless you're spoken to. So she's showed tremendous courage, even as a child. And she has obviously spoken up on behalf of her brother. And I believe that God spoke through her that day. Now, that didn't just happen as a result of, oh, you know, she was just in the right. There was a series of training that happened from her parents. So they would have trained her to know God for herself. As parents, they were good stewards of their children. So they made sure that whatever was it that they instilled in her, that she knew God for herself. So she spoke up on behalf of her brother, and she volunteered her very own mother to nurse this baby. So how incredible is God that he would use Moses' own mother to nurse her own child? Like, how awesome is that?
My gosh. So
she obviously then, Moses' own mother nursed Moses until he was of age, and then gave him to Pharaoh's daughter. So what do we learn first and foremost? That she was a loving sister. So she had to really love her little brother. This is something that we can learn in our day-to-day lives. Are we being a good sibling? Are we being how do we feel towards our siblings? This is something that we can very much see reflected. Would we have been willing to do that? Would we have been willing to pay that price for any family member? The next thing that we see is her faith. Miriam had a strong faith, and she trusted God. So in everything that she was doing, it took a trust in God. And that's exactly what we saw. Now we see that obviously, that's all that we hear of Miriam for some time. So then we fast forward to, I believe it's Exodus chapter 15. So let's fast forward to Exodus chapter 15. And obviously within the story, it's obviously quite a lengthy story. We see that Moses he leaves Egypt because he killed an Egyptian. So he has to flee. And he obviously then gets married, and obviously it's a very long story. So for time's sake, I don't want to go too much into it. And God calls him to basically rescue his people. So he calls him back to rescue his people. And Moses, alongside his brother Aaron, they go back into Egypt to free the people, to free their people. And we meet Miriam back again in Exodus chapter 15. So this is when now Pharaoh has let the people go. He's let them go. So they've obviously they've gone through a series of different plagues and different turmoil and different trials. And we now see Miriam back again in chapter 15. And she leads this song. And this is the first song actually recorded in the Bible, if you didn't know. And she leads this song of thanksgiving unto God. So in all of this, she's had this relationship with God, and she doesn't take God for granted. She's very specific in her thanksgiving to God. And I'll read it very briefly. I'm not going to read all of it for time's sake, but you can obviously read it and expand on it in your own time. And she presents herself as a leader, because ultimately she is leading these women. And it says, then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he is hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. So in all of this, they're both very specific in what they're thankful for, because they don't take it for granted. And I think that's something that we can learn today, that sometimes when God delivers us from trials, we don't actually stop to say thank you. What are we actually thankful for when God delivers us? It's very easy to forget where we've come from. And it's very easy to forget, we now look the part, we now talk the part. And there's so much power in our story and in our testimony. And Pastor Q will know that I'm an advocate of sharing your story, that there's so much power and there's so much life in our story and in our testimony. And they were thankful and they were grateful to God. And this is something that as women, do never be ashamed of where God has brought you from. Never be ashamed of your testimony. Never dumb down what God has done for you, and always have a thanksgiving heart. And we see that she is a strong and caring leader. And it was when it was God's perfect time to deliver the Israelites from bondage, he chose Moses to carry out his will. And by this time, Moses had been living in Midian and he had a wife and 2 sons. He spent his days tending his father's flocks. So we see that God has used Miriam to work hand in hand with her brother. So a good leader allows room for others.
Yes.
So it allows for others. She wasn't threatened by Moses' leadership. She didn't say, well, why shouldn't I be the one to part the sea? God, why shouldn't it be me? She was submitted to his leadership. And that's something as women as today, yes, we can be called into leadership, but great leadership is also knowing how to serve. We have to know that, being called a leader, and I think this title gets thrown around a lot, that we don't abuse the power that God gives to us. So we have to be servant leaders, as we like to call it.
Yes.
Another thing that I would really like to bring out with Miriam is her courage. She displayed tremendous courage. And, in our lives today, courage is something that causes you to have to go and do things that sometimes is not comfortable. God will sometimes call us to do things that is not comfortable, that is not something that we want to do freely. Oftentimes, when God calls you, it takes a dying to yourself. It takes tremendous courage to speak out, to walk out his will, to walk out his purpose. And we see that demonstrated in Miriam, even from a child. She has displayed tremendous courage. She has, walked into places where, it's not certain. Like she, at every point, even going to Pharaoh's daughter, she could have been put to death for speaking up. Yes. And that as a child, even from a child, and I would encourage you as mothers, as grandmothers, as aunties, as stewards of children, that it's never too young to empower your children. It's never too young. They're never too young to speak into their lives. So she displayed tremendous courage. And then I want to talk about us just, again, being a good leader. So it's about being taught by God. God will give you all the skills, all the tools that you need in order to be a good leader, but we have to avail ourselves to it. She was someone that people wanted to be around. What kind of leader are we? Are we just the leader that kind of rules people, but we don't take into consideration their feelings? What kind of leader are we? Leaders don't just sit back and watch. Miriam didn't just accept that her brother would float down the Nile to uncertain circumstances. Instead, she watched and took action when she saw Pharaoh's daughter's slave retrieve Moses' basket from the water. Do you sit back and let others do all the work? Or do you step up and take action as a leader? And this is something that is relevant today. As a leader, are you a dictator? Or are you somebody that actually will rise up and actually get in the gutters with people, get in the trenches with people, and actually lead alongside them? So I just want to read quickly on the topic of leadership. So Titus chapter 2, verses 3-5, it says, likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good, that they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. As women, we are supposed to pass on that information to the next generation. We are supposed to teach the next generation. Everything that I have gleaned has been from we've sat at the feet of older women. As children, as young girls, Pastor Q can testify to this, we would literally glean from them. Everything that I know now about marriage, everything that I know about God is because I sat at somebody's feet and I gleaned from them. And we can't think that we know it all. A great leader is someone that is not afraid to sit at somebody's feet and actually learn from them and be teachable.
That's so good.
And I'm not sure how I'm doing for time.
Go. You're full. I'm gonna let you just go ahead and flow.
One of the other things that we look at is to use our gifts for God's glory. And God gives each of us unique gifts, where he gives us these gifts that we're to use to enhance his kingdom. And Miriam discovered that she had been given the gift of prophecy. So she was actually a prophet in the Bible. And she used this gift to help lead the Israelites to the promised land, along with her brothers Moses and Aaron. And she had a willing and a servant attitude. So God was able to use her because she was willing. God was able to use her because she made herself an available vessel. And I think that that's something that we can learn today. You know, are you available for what God wants to do? Are you available for what God wants to, how he wants to move? You know, sometimes we're so rigid in, you know, our lives, we're not flexible. And God, when he calls you, he needs you to be ready to move and to do whatever he wants you to do. And a lot of the times we are so stuck in our lives, or we have a plan of what we think that life should look like. Yes. And we're not available to him. So it's about us being flexible, pliable, so that God can use us for his glory. We then learn so fast forward the story, that Miriam, obviously, as they get older, you know, they're in the wilderness and they never get to the promised land, which is really sad. But Miriam then becomes, I think, a little bit complacent. She starts to complain. She starts to murmur against Moses and his wife. And, you know, that causes her to have a curse on her life. God's like, listen, like, don't forget yourself. And he causes her to then have leprosy. Now, this is a humbling experience. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been humbled by God. It's not a pretty experience. It's not a nice experience. It's, you know, dying to yourself. And some of us complain against God. We murmur against God. We talk about other people. We gossip about other people. And we think that that's okay. That's not okay.
Right.
Never forget where God has brought you from. And don't be quick to judge others, because the same way, the very thing that God has delivered you from, listen, he will humble you in a quick minute. And it's about us being good stewards, you know, our conduct, the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we speak about others, the words that come out of our mouth as women. We have so much power and life in our words. And we have the power to build up, to encourage, to empower. But in the same breath, we have the ability to tear down and to destroy. And I would encourage you, be careful of how you use your mouth. Be careful of what comes out of your mouth. Be careful of what you say. And it might not be as extreme as obviously in Miriam's story, where she was struck with leprosy, but our mouth can become a hindrance to the blessings that God has for us in our lives. So be careful what comes out of our mouth. Be good stewards of the words that come out of our mouth. And remember that our children are watching us. Our children are literally, we are mirroring God to them. And we have to be, obviously, I run a children's ministry in our church, and I see the value and the importance of imparting into the next generation. And just like I said from the beginning, this story started with Miriam from a really young age. She became this child that her parents poured into. They made God known to her. And we see it demonstrated all throughout her life that God was able to use her because she was a willing and an open vessel. And, you know, I would encourage us as parents, as stewards, that we must steward our children. They're never too young to know God. And what we put into them is what's going to be demonstrated. That's what's going to be manifested.
Wow. I know for a fact that everyone listening, watching, you have already been blessed. Thank you, Pastor Danny, for so many packed nuggets in there. So we're going to take a moment to unpack just a few. I know our time isn't real long with one another, but I just want to talk about that. You brought up the sibling piece earlier, and that's some topics that we don't really tackle. We'll talk about husband and wife. We'll talk about singlehood, but what about siblinghood?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it just hit me. It just resonated. That's the direction we need to take as we move forward in the discussion, because you brought up some very relevant points. And then we're looking at siblings right now, right? We got two brothers and a sister, right? And then I think about the word sibling rivalry, right?
Yeah.
And what can happen in those cases. Let's talk about it from a perspective of when we think about siblings and the rivalries that take place and the pain that has taken place over the years, and people that they don't even talk to one another and don't really like one another, and how they can navigate those places to get themselves to a place of healing, wholeness, restoration.
Yes.
That rivalry really in the eyes of God
Yeah.
should be named among us. Can we dive deeper into that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that this is so prevalent in our society today, where, it's almost become a norm and a culture that it's okay for siblings to not agree. And I think that this is something as parents that we have to be really intentional about. I know in a lot of cultures that a lot of parents play one sibling off of another, and they maybe favor one sibling over another. And I think what we have to realize is these things take root in our children's hearts. If we can have the power to cause good relationships amongst our children, or we can cause them to be each other's enemies. Because if we're constantly comparing, one's smarter, one's lighter skinned, one's more attractive, these are all real things that go on in households. These are real things that go on amongst siblings, And I think that as parents, as a parent, I'm very conscious that, what I put into Ashley is I have to be very intentional with. And I think that as siblings, this is something that we can really glean from this, because she had the opportunity. She could have thrown him under the bus. She could have been like, see ya, like more of mum and dad for me, when Moses was sent down the river. But no, there was something in her that loved him. And it was a genuine love and care and protection. And even in her child state, she was able to protect her brother.
That's so true. And then when you think about, even let's take it from another angle. Like, yes, we have to be so careful as parents that we don't compare our children, because that is the seed that has been growing. And you're wondering why they're at odds. We're wondering why there's such, a distance. Perhaps we've sown that seed. Perhaps we've sown, and perhaps there's a time of us where we can just go to our kids. You know what? Forgive me, because and then begin to really accentuate what's the gold in them, pulling out the greatness that's already on the inside of them. And if we learn how to accentuate the greatness and not always ponder on the weakness, then we will find ourselves molding the child into the way that God desires him to be or her to be. And it's a very delicate situation. And even when we're grown, now let's talk about we're grown, right? And we're still having that piece. And let's not necessarily totally remove the parents from the conversation. But now we are at an age where now we're accountable and now we're responsible for how we interact. How about children? And this is a great example of you. You're a pastor. Your sister's a pastor. Your brother's in the church and in leadership. How did you make that work? Were there any times, because you all have your great individual abilities and successes? You want to talk to me about that, how you guys navigated that as siblings growing up? Yes.
I'll be honest, I think Sarah, obviously you'll hear from her at some point. She was called to ministry from a really young age. And she made that decision from a really young age. And I think she was obviously, in terms of ministry, she was projected into ministry, I guess, a lot earlier. And I think that comes with its challenges, because it does, there's room for a feeling of inadequacy. There is that, okay, well, am I good enough? Like, is if God's going to use me, is it in the same form? Is my ministry the same? Or, and I think that my piece really came from allowing God to really minister to my heart and knowing God for myself. And, you know, God has a specific purpose and a plan for each individual's life. You know, even if you're from the same household, even if you've been raised in the same way, he has an individual plan and a purpose for each and every single one of our lives. So what looks like for Sarah is completely different for me. And, you know, I've really grown into my calling and the way that God uses me. And, you know, I've learned that God really uses my vulnerability, and that's different to the way that he, for example, uses Sarah's gifting, you know. And I think that my ministry is very much called to healing other women. And, you know, but I at no point am I now threatened by the gift when Sarah preaches. Oh, she's an awesome preacher. But I think that it's really spending time in God's presence, allowing him to speak into your life and knowing what he has for you specifically. And there is always room for everybody. You know, God makes room for all of our gifts. He doesn't limit it to one or the other. It just may be different, and different is okay. And different, comfortable with that.
Yes, yes. Different is okay. Are you hearing that, ladies? Different is okay. And you hear me saying, don't compare yourself to the one. You're not one out of a million. You're one out of one. Yes. Love your individuality, because you'll never be able to match up, to compete with the 999,000 that you never can. So you're one out of one. And that's a very important message, that you grow into what God is calling you to be and to do. And sometimes there are others that will, right in your household, that may start sooner, and that's okay, because God has a timing and a plan just for you. And that's the richness of being that individual that God is calling you to be. And our time is winding, and it's so unfortunate, but I do not want to leave without our Pastor Danny talking to Miriam the last time, giving her words of encouragement and hope. So Pastor Danny, just the next minute or two, would you speak to Miriam?
Yeah, so I want to speak to the Miriam in all of you ladies, you know, and I think the one thing that I realized about Miriam is that she understood purpose. And, you know, you may be flittering between, you know, God, what have you called me to do? But it's about trusting in God's plan and his purpose for your life. And even though, like Pastor Q said, you know, you may be in a household where there's powerhouses, you know, where other people's gifts are on display, you may say, don't ever think that God hasn't got a plan and a purpose for your life. It might not be that your purpose is to be on a stage. It might be that you go and feed the homeless. You know, that might be your call. It might be that you may be in the background, but that's okay, because God has called you for a specific purpose, just like he did with Miriam. Yes, she was called to be a leader. Yes, she was called to be this powerhouse of a sister. Yes, she was called to be this caring and compassionate woman, but she understood purpose. And I really want to encourage you today to understand your purpose, because when you understand what God has called you to do, you are unstoppable. You know, there's nothing, it doesn't matter what people say to you. It doesn't matter what people do to you. You understand purpose. And I really encourage you today to seek out your purpose. Spend time in God's presence until you find what that purpose is. And he will, when God manifests himself to you, when you become an available vessel for God to use, he will blow your mind. There is nothing that he cannot do through you. And the more that you make yourself available to him, the more he will show himself off in you. And I'm a living testimony to that God is able to take the most broken. He's able to restore. He's able to build back up. So whatever your story is, God's not done with you yet. He has still got work to do. Just make yourself available to him, and he will surely do it.
Woo! Thank you, Pastor Danny. So powerful. And I'm just so proud of you and where God has brought you and where God is taking you. The best really is yet to come. Thank you, audience, for being so attentive today. I know you gleaned from this woman of God, this woman of power. Thank you for having the ears to hear today, and may it change you from the inside out. And remember, we're doing this every Tuesday evening. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 7:30. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Amen.